The Strategic Vacuum, January 5th, 2026. USNI News Fleet and Marine Tracker publishes its weekly carrier disposition report. 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers in the United States Navy. 0 operating in the Middle East, not a single one. For the first time since October 7th, 2023, when Hamas attacked Israel, the U.S. Navy has completely withdrawn carrier strike groups from the Central Command area of responsibility. Here's what makes that absence critical. Iran is experiencing the most severe internal crisis since the 1979 revolution, nationwide protests. Over 100 dead from security forces using live ammunition. Oil worker strikes threatening regime revenue, reports of military defections at lower ranks, internet connectivity reduced to near zero trying to suppress the movement. The Islamic Republic is facing an existential threat from within. And at this exact moment, 0 American aircraft carriers operate within striking distance. No USS Abraham Lincoln with its F-35C stealth fighters, no USS Harry S. Truman conducting Red Sea patrols, no carrier air wings providing 75 aircraft packages that can reach Tehran in under 2 hours, no Arleigh Burke destroyers positioned in the Persian Gulf with 96 vertical launch cells loaded with Tomahawk cruise missiles. Nothing. The numbers tell a different story than the previous 15 months. Throughout 2025, Central Command deployments consumed 41% of all U.S. carrier steaming days. That's up from just 8% the year before October 7th. The Harry S. Truman spent 7 months shooting down Houthi missiles over the Red Sea. The Carl Vinson operated for 7 months in the Arabian Sea, conducting airstrikes against Houthi positions in Yemen. Between March 15th and May 6th, 2025, U.S. forces struck over 1,000 Houthi targets. The USS Nimitz was pulled from South China Sea patrols and rushed to the Persian Gulf. Constant presence, visible deterrence, the floating symbol of American power projection sitting over the horizon, forcing adversaries to calculate the cost of aggression. That ended on January 5th. 30,000 American troops remained scattered across bases in Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Qatar. 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, 3 littoral combat ships, 6 warships total, Air Force squadrons at Al Udeid in Qatar and other regional bases. But no carrier strike group, no 4.5 acres of sovereign American territory that moves 700 miles per day and projects power 300 miles in every direction. The question isn't just where did the carriers go? The question is, why did the Pentagon accept a deterrence gap in one of the most volatile regions on Earth at the moment when Iran is most vulnerable and therefore most dangerous? The answer reveals a brutal reality about American naval power in 2026. The United States Navy operates 11 carriers but can't maintain presence in 3 theaters simultaneously. Not anymore. Choices are being made, priorities are being set, and the Middle East just dropped to 3rd place behind 2 more critical missions. This is the story of strategic overstretch. If you want to understand the limits of American sea power when the world catches fire in multiple places at once, type overextended in the comments. Welcome to Navy Decoded. This is why there are 0 carriers in the Middle East. The Venezuela question. To understand where the carriers went, look 4,500 miles west of the Persian Gulf, the Caribbean Sea, Operation Southern Spear. What started as counter-narcotics operations escalated into the most significant U.S. military action in the Western Hemisphere since the invasion of Panama in 1989. August 2025. The USS Iwo Jima Amphibious Ready Group deploys to the Caribbean. LHD-7, a Wasp-class amphibious assault ship carrying 2,500 Marines from the 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit. The stated mission is supporting Department of Homeland Security operations against drug trafficking networks. The real capability is regime change. September through December 2025. U.S. forces conduct airstrikes on vessels allegedly transporting drugs for Venezuelan cartels, small boats in the Eastern Pacific and Caribbean. At least 105 people killed across multiple strikes. Then the mission escalates beyond counter-narcotics. November 11th, 2025. The USS Gerald R. Ford arrives in the Caribbean, CVN 78, the most advanced aircraft carrier ever constructed, commissioned in 2017 after a $13 billion construction program at Newport News Shipbuilding. This is not a ship you send for drug interdiction. This is the future of naval aviation delivered 5 years ahead of the rest of the fleet. The Ford carries revolutionary technology, electromagnetic aircraft launch system, EMALS, replacing steam catapults, advanced arresting gear using electromagnetic energy absorption, dual-band radar providing 360-degree coverage. The ship launches and recovers aircraft 33% faster than Nimitz-class carriers. It operates with 600 fewer crew members because of automated systems. It generates 3 times the electrical power. Carrier Air Wing 8 embarked on Ford. 4 FA-18EF Super Hornet squadrons. EA-18G Growlers for electronic attack. E-2D Advanced Hawkeyes. The Air Wing can execute 270 sorties per day versus 140 for older carriers. This is overwhelming strike capacity positioned not in the Persian Gulf, but in the Caribbean Sea. December 2025. The mission transforms from strikes on boats to direct action against Venezuelan state infrastructure. U.S. forces begin seizing oil tankers. The Trump administration calls them ghost fleet vessels operating in violation of sanctions. Marines and Navy SEALs launch from the Gerald R. Ford and pre-dawn helicopter raids. They board and capture the motor tanker Alina, the Sofia, the Veronica, 5 tankers seized carrying Venezuelan crude oil worth over $50 million per vessel. Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem announces each seizure. The ships were attempting to evade U.S. forces after departing Venezuela. False flag registrations, sanctioned cargo. The Trump administration declares a naval quarantine on Venezuelan oil exports. No sanctioned vessel leaves the Caribbean without interception. Then, January 3rd, 2026, Operation Absolute Resolve, the strike on Caracas, explosions reported at 2 a.m. local time. F-35A Lightning II fighters from Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. F-22 Raptors providing air superiority. Special Operations Forces from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, Delta Force operators. They capture Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife from a secured compound in the capital. Helicopter extraction. The aircraft lands on USS Iwo Jima. From there, transport to New York, where Maduro faces charges related to narco-terrorism and drug trafficking. The operation succeeds because months of preparation degraded Venezuelan defensive capability. Intelligence sources indicate CIA cyber operations compromised Venezuelan command and control systems. Modified hardware purchased years earlier contained backdoors. On January 3rd, those access points activate. Venezuelan air defense radar goes dark. Fire control systems fail. Armored unit communications collapse. The entire military infrastructure loses network connectivity during the critical 4-hour window. Here's the strategic cost of that success. The USS Gerald R. Ford deployed from Norfolk on June 24, 2025. The ship has been continuously deployed for 6 months. The crew operates under wartime tempo, flight operations around the clock, combat missions over Venezuela, tanker seizures every week, and the Ford isn't leaving the Caribbean. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated on January 5th that the naval presence will continue. What you're seeing is an oil quarantine that allows us to exert tremendous leverage over what happens next. 15 to 20,000 U.S. troops occupy the region across the amphibious Ready Group and Carrier Strike Group. The Trump administration views control of Venezuelan oil as a generational strategic opportunity. Trump told Fox News on January 10th he expects oil companies to invest at least $100 billion rebuilding Venezuela's petroleum infrastructure. That's America's most advanced carrier locked in the Caribbean, enforcing a blockade and supporting regime transition operations instead of deterring Iran from closing the Strait of Hormuz. The Pacific equation. While the Ford operates in Venezuela, 2 more carriers remain locked in the Indo-Pacific, both unavailable for Middle East contingencies, both positioned to counter the threat that Pentagon planners consider the only peer competitor to American military power, China. The USS Abraham Lincoln operates from Guam as of January 2026, CVN-72, Nimitz-class carrier that holds the record for longest sustained deployment in modern naval history. 295 consecutive days at sea in 2020. No port calls, no maintenance breaks. Just continuous operations, proving the ship and crew can sustain combat tempo longer than any adversary. Between 2013 and 2017, the Navy invested $3 billion in refueling and complex overhaul. 4 years at Newport News Shipbuilding. Technicians cut the hull open, they removed both A4W nuclear reactors, and installed new cores providing 25 years of propulsion. Every system was upgraded. Fiber optic networks replacing copper wiring. New radar systems. Most critical for 2026 operations, Lincoln became the first Nimitz-class carrier, specifically modified for F-35C Lightning II operations. Reinforced jet blast deflectors handle the extreme heat from the F-35C's Pratt & Whitney F-135 engine. Upgraded electrical systems support the fighter's massive power requirements for sensors and mission systems. Maintenance facilities designed for low observable coatings. The Lincoln isn't just compatible with 5th-generation fighters, it's optimized for them. Carrier Air Wing 9 embarked on Lincoln. Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 314, VMFA 314, the Black Knights, 10 F-35C stealth fighters, 3 FA-18EF Super Hornet squadrons with 36 aircraft total, EA-18G Growlers, E-2D Hawkeyes, MH-60R Seahawk helicopters, 75 aircraft designed to penetrate contested airspace that would destroy conventional strike packages. The Lincoln arrived in Guam on December 12, 2025. Since then, the carrier has conducted patrols in the Philippine Sea and South China Sea. Standard presence operations signaling American commitment to allies, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, all watching Chinese naval expansion and calculating how long they can depend on American security guarantees. The People's Liberation Army Navy operates 3 aircraft carriers as of 2026, Liaoning, Shandong, and Fujian. A 4th carrier is under construction at Jiangnan Shipyard, 5th and 6th planned. China's shipbuilding capacity exceeds American yards by an order of magnitude. They can replace losses. They can expand their fleet while the U.S. struggles to maintain 11 hulls built decades ago. Chinese carriers operate with limitations. Ski jump launches instead of catapults reduce aircraft payload and range. Liaoning and Shandong carry J-15 fighters, 4th-generation aircraft inferior to F/A-18 Super Hornets. But Fujian incorporates electromagnetic catapults. The capability gap is closing. And Chinese doctrine doesn't require matching American carriers one for one. They need sufficient capability to contest the first island chain, to make intervention in a Taiwan scenario costly enough that Washington hesitates. The USS George Washington operates from Yokosuka, Japan, CVN-73, the only American carrier permanently forward deployed overseas, homeported in Japan since 2008. This ship provides U.S. 7th Fleet with immediate strike capability. Any crisis on the Korean Peninsula or in the Taiwan Strait, the George Washington responds within hours, not days. Pulling the George Washington from Japan creates a vacuum that Beijing would immediately exploit. Chinese military planners watch carrier movements obsessively. They maintain detailed tracking of every American naval asset in the Western Pacific. If both the Lincoln and Washington redeployed to the Middle East, the window opens. Not maybe, certainly. The People's Liberation Army has contingency plans waiting for exactly this scenario. So the Pentagon faces an impossible choice: send carriers to deter Iran or keep carriers to deter China, protect 30,000 troops in the Middle East, or protect treaty allies facing existential threats, secure oil flowing through Hormuz, or secure freedom of navigation through the Taiwan Strait. When you operate 11 carriers and the world demands presence in 4 theaters simultaneously, you start making choices about which commitments are negotiable. In January 2026, the Middle East became negotiable. The Indo-Pacific did not. The maintenance trap. Here's where the numbers become impossible. The U.S. Navy operates 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. That should provide overwhelming global presence. 3 carriers deployed, 3 carriers in workup training for deployment, 3 carriers in maintenance, 2 carriers in extended overhaul. That's the theoretical cycle. The reality in January 2026 looks different. 7 carriers sit pierside in the United States in various stages of maintenance, repair, or refit. They're not available for crisis response. They're not available for deployment. They're not available at all. The USS John C. Stennis is at Newport News Shipbuilding undergoing midlife refueling and complex overhaul. CVN-74 entered the yard in 2021. The scheduled completion was 2025. Delays pushed the date to 2027. That is 6 years, 1 ship spends cut open with reactors removed and systems scattered across the facility. 6 years of zero operational capability. The USS Theodore Roosevelt completed a maintenance availability in late 2025. CVN-71 is technically ready for deployment, but the ship needs months of training before it can operate in contested environments, carrier qualifications, air wing integration, strike group workups. The Roosevelt won't reach the Middle East before mid-2026, even if ordered to deploy immediately. The USS Harry S. Truman returned to Norfolk after 7 months deployed to Central Command. CVN-75 conducted continuous operations in the Red Sea, shooting down Houthi missiles and drones. The crew intercepted weapons in actual combat conditions. Real missiles, real consequences. But 7 months of high-tempo operations followed by extended deployment wears down ships and sailors. The Truman needs maintenance. The crew needs recovery time. Pushing them back out creates cascading failures. This is the maintenance trap. Every deployment deferred means more work accumulates. Every extension means worse material condition when the ship finally reaches the yard. The Government Accountability Office released a report in December 2024 documenting the crisis. Poor material condition of ships, delayed maintenance overhauls preventing scheduled operations, decisions to divest vessels before completing their expected service lives because the cost of repair exceeds the value of keeping them operational. The picture that went viral tells the story. USS Dewey during a port visit in Singapore. An Arleigh Burke-class destroyer covered in running rust, visible corrosion down the hull. That's what happens when you extend deployments repeatedly and defer maintenance. Ships that should be combat-ready instead become floating examples of strategic decay. The USS Carl Vinson operated in the Arabian Sea through late 2025. CVN-70 conducted 7 months of strikes against Houthi positions in Yemen. Now the ship sits in San Diego undergoing post-deployment maintenance. Even if operational tempo permitted immediate redeployment, the Vinson needs weeks of work before it's ready. Only 3 carriers are currently deployed worldwide. The Gerald R. Ford in the Caribbean, the Abraham Lincoln in the Indo-Pacific, the George Washington Forward deployed in Japan. That's it. 8 carriers either in maintenance or in training. 0 carriers available for immediate surge to the Middle East without accepting unacceptable risk in other theaters. This is the brutal mathematics of naval power in 2026. 11 carriers sounds overwhelming until you understand that at any moment, maybe 3 operate in deployable status. Maybe 4 if you accept risk. The world demands presence in the Caribbean, the Western Pacific, the Mediterranean, and the Persian Gulf simultaneously. The fleet can't deliver. Choices get made, priorities get set. And right now, Iran is at the bottom of that priority list. The Iranian calculation. While American carriers operate elsewhere, Iran faces its worst internal crisis since 1979. And Tehran's military planners are watching the empty Persian Gulf very carefully. January 11th, 2026. Casualties from the protests exceed 100 dead. Iranian security forces are using live ammunition against demonstrators. Mass arrests. The government imposed a near-total internet blackout, reducing national connectivity to minimal levels, trying to suppress the movement. It's not working. The unrest has expanded into strategic sectors. Oil workers at refineries and ports have launched strikes. Reports indicate defections among lower-ranking military personnel. This threatens regime cohesion at the most fundamental level. President Trump initially responded with threats. January the 2nd, he stated the U.S. was locked and loaded, ready to rescue protesters if Iran continued using lethal force against them. He told demonstrators that American help is on the way. Then, on January 16th, Trump walked back those threats. He told reporters he was convinced on good authority that the killing had stopped. He claimed 800 planned executions were halted, a claim that couldn't be verified. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi denied any execution plans existed. Behind Trump's reversal was a classified briefing. Senior military officials presented the president with an assessment. Any U.S. military strike against Iran during these protests would be extraordinarily dangerous. It could risk the lives of thousands of American service members stationed across the region. The regime would interpret kinetic action not as limited coercion, but as an existential threat designed to exploit internal weakness and force regime collapse. A U.S. intelligence source warned on January 10th that the Iranian response to strikes carried out during these protests would be anything but measured. This is the strategic dilemma. When a regime believes it's facing existential collapse, deterrence stops working. They have nothing left to lose, every weapon gets used, every capability gets employed. Iran has positioned thousands of ballistic and cruise missiles along the Persian Gulf coast, mobile launchers that relocate after every exercise, hardened facilities built into mountain complexes, swarms of fast attack boats operated by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy designed for asymmetric warfare against larger, conventional vessels, naval mines that could be deployed across choke points within hours. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 21 million barrels of oil transit through that strait every day. That represents roughly 20% of global petroleum consumption. Iran's anti-access area denial strategy, A2AD, is designed specifically to make that waterway impassable in the event of conflict. They can't defeat the U.S. Navy in open combat. They don't need to. They need to impose unacceptable economic costs by disrupting global energy markets. Here's what makes the current situation dangerous. Without a carrier strike group in the region, Iran's calculus changes. In 2025, when the Carl Vinson, or Harry S. Truman, operated in the Gulf of Oman, Iranian commanders knew that any attempt to close Hormuz would bring immediate, overwhelming retaliation. F-35Cs would penetrate their air defenses within hours. EA-18G Growlers would jam their radar networks. Super Hornets would strike mobile missile launchers and command nodes before Iranian forces could coordinate a sustained campaign. Deterrence worked because the capability sat 100 miles offshore. Visible. Immediate. Certain. In January 2026, that certainty disappeared. If Iran attempted to close the Strait of Hormuz right now, the Pentagon would need at minimum 8 days to position a carrier strike group. The USS Abraham Lincoln, operating from Guam, would have to transit through the Strait of Malacca, cross the Indian Ocean, and enter the Persian Gulf. That's 4,500 nautical miles at 25 knots, 8 days minimum. 8 days where oil prices spike to $150 per barrel or higher. 8 days where global markets panic. 8 days where shipping companies halt all Middle East traffic. 8 days where American allies question whether security guarantees mean anything when the guarantor isn't present. Asian officials are particularly concerned. Nikkei Asia reported on January 13th that officials in Tokyo, Seoul, and Canberra are increasingly worried Washington may divert Indo-Pacific carriers to the Middle East if crisis escalates. That would leave China with freedom of action. The nightmare scenario where American commitments in one theater create vulnerabilities in another. Tehran knows this. The clerics watch the same USNI fleet tracker everyone else monitors. They see January 5th marked the first time since October 2023 with 0 carriers in Central Command as area of responsibility. They're calculating whether this represents temporary repositioning or permanent strategic shift, whether American deterrence is backed by actual capability or running on reputation alone. For now, deterrence holds. Iran hasn't attempted to close Hormuz. Houthi forces in Yemen have reduced their attacks on shipping. Proxy militias in Iraq and Syria haven't launched major strikes on American bases, but that restraint depends on Tehran believing that absent carriers can return quickly if needed. It depends on Iranian commanders thinking the cost of action still exceeds any potential gain. That belief becomes harder to maintain when carriers visibly operate 4,500 miles away, enforcing a Venezuelan oil embargo with no indication they're coming back. The new reality. The complete absence of carriers from the Middle East isn't a temporary scheduling gap. It's a structural inflection point in American power projection, a moment when the gap between commitments and capabilities becomes impossible to hide. For 3 decades after the Cold War, the U.S. Navy operated without peer competitors. Carriers deployed wherever Washington decided. No one could contest American naval dominance. That era ended. China fields DF-21D and DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles with ranges exceeding 1,000 miles. Russia develops Poseidon nuclear-powered torpedoes and Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles. Iran builds precision-guided ballistic missiles by the thousands. The costs of power projection are rising while available forces remain constant or decline. The Navy that maintained global coverage with 11 carriers can't maintain that coverage when those 11 carriers face more threats, longer maintenance requirements, more simultaneous crises, and higher operational tempo than ever before. So choices get made, priorities get set, and in January 2026, those priorities became explicit. Venezuela matters more than Iran, not militarily, strategically. The Trump administration sees controlling Venezuelan oil as generational opportunity. Trump told Fox News on January 10th, he expects American oil companies to invest $100 billion rebuilding Venezuela's petroleum infrastructure over the next decade. That's energy independence from OPEC. That's leverage over global oil prices for the next 30 years. That's why the Gerald R. Ford stays in the Caribbean enforcing the naval quarantine. American forces aren't leaving until a friendly government controls those oil fields. China matters more than Iran. The Indo-Pacific is where great power competition determines the next century. Taiwan is where World War III starts if deterrence fails. Beijing watches American carrier deployments with obsessive attention. If both Pacific carriers redeploy to the Middle East, China moves on Taiwan. The window opens. The People's Liberation Army has operational plans waiting for this exact scenario. So the Abraham Lincoln and George Washington remain in the Western Pacific regardless of what happens in Tehran. The Middle East gets what's left. 3 Arleigh Burke destroyers, Air Force squadrons at regional bases, 30,000 troops without carrier-based air cover. The Pentagon is betting that deterrence holds through reputation, that Iran still believes absent American carriers can return quickly enough that closing Hormuz remains too costly, that adversaries won't test whether the emperor still has clothes when the emperor is obviously stretched thin. That's a weaker deterrent than visible presence. And everyone knows it. Tehran knows it. Beijing knows it. Moscow knows it. They're watching this moment carefully, testing whether American security guarantees mean anything when America can't physically be present to enforce them. The protesters in Iran are finding out what conditional guarantees mean. Trump said help is on the way. Then military officials briefed him that the forces weren't positioned for success, that the Gerald R. Ford operates in the Caribbean, that the Abraham Lincoln can't be in 2 places simultaneously. So Trump walked it back. The protesters continue dying while American carriers enforce an oil embargo 4,500 miles away. 30,000 American troops scattered across Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Qatar are finding out what happens when the most visible symbol of American military power disappears from their theater. They have Patriot missile batteries, they have F-16s and F-15Es at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. But they don't have a carrier strike group sitting 100 miles offshore ready to respond within minutes if Tehran decides to test American resolve. For now, the line holds. Iran hasn't closed the Strait of Hormuz. Deterrence survives on the belief that American carriers can return if needed. But January 2026 marks the moment when that deterrence stopped being guaranteed by visible presence and started depending on adversaries calculating that America will surge forces when necessary. That calculation works until it doesn't, until Iran miscalculates, until Beijing decides the window is open, until Moscow decides to create another crisis, knowing American carriers can't cover every theater simultaneously. This is the new reality of American naval power. 11 carriers sound overwhelming until you understand that 3 are deployed, 5 are in maintenance, 2 are in extended overhaul, and 1 is surging to respond to the crisis no one predicted. The world demands presence in 4 theaters simultaneously. The fleet can deliver 2, maybe 3, if you accept risk elsewhere. So choices get made. Venezuela over Iran, China over the Middle East, Great power competition over regional contingencies. Hope that deterrence holds through reputation when it can't hold through presence. The next time you fill your car with gasoline, remember why it's possible. Not because 11 carriers provide overwhelming power, but because so far, Iran still believes those 11 carriers will respond even when they're not there. 21 million barrels of oil flow through the Strait of Hormuz daily because Tehran calculates the cost of closing it exceeds any benefit. That calculation depends on fear of American retaliation. Right now, that fear is based on memory of past presence, not actual current capability. If that memory fades, if Iranian commanders start believing that absent American carriers represent permanent American absence, the entire structure collapses. This is deterrence by reputation in an era when reputation isn't backed by visible presence. It works until it stops working. And when it stops, the consequences cascade across global energy markets, alliance structures, and regional stability faster than carriers can transit from the Caribbean or Western Pacific to respond. If this analysis showed you the structural limits of American sea power in a multipolar world, you belong here on Navy Decoded. Hit subscribe for the next breakdown of how naval strategy actually works when perfect choices don't exist.